going to be recorded, as you've just heard, and we'll post it up afterwards online. And also, to go with this panel, there is a report that has been written by Tom Bacon, who's on the panel, and we will make that available to all the attendees after the event via email, and you can download it if you want. So without further ado, I'm going to get the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'm just going to tell you how the event will run. So I don't know if everyone's seeing the same sort of image, but let's just start on the right with Marty, please.
Yes, Martin Smith. I'm a longtime producer and correspondent for PBS Frontline, the documentary series in the US. I've done a lot of work in the Middle East, especially of late.
And can you just tell the audience who might, many of them who are European and might not be so familiar with you, Marty, what were you doing in 2021?
Well, in 2021, when was that? I was in Afghanistan most recently, and prior to that, I was in northern Syria. I guess that was in 2020. So I've worked Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, all in the last couple of years since COVID hit. And
Nima, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nima Elbagir. I'm a correspondent with CNN. I focus on investigations and kind of leveraging slightly hard to reach places. So this year we focused on Yemen, the north, the Houthi-controlled north, and we really went in very hard on the Horn of Africa. So Ethiopia and Sudan, where I'm from.
Great. And Clionadh, do you want to tell everyone who you are and what ACLED is?
Sure.
They don't already know.
Okay, happy to. My name is Clionadh Raleigh. I'm a professor of political violence and geography at the University of Sussex and the executive director of ACLED, which is a data observatory, global data observatory and analysis project. And so we cover real-time conflict events as reported around the world through our local partners and also through different media outlets. Thanks.
Great. And Ian?
Hi, my name is Ian Phillips. I'm head of international news at the Associated Press, based in New York. I've been in this job for about 5 years. Prior to that, based in Cairo as head of the Middle East. And for this year, I am running a review of AP's security and safety policies and crisis management and online harassment, all of the stuff that comes in that space, and speaking to Colin quite a lot about what to do.
And lastly, Tom.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom Bacon. So as Colin mentioned, I run RiskPal, the risk assessment platform. We work with a number of media organisations globally, and I co-authored the report, which you will all receive tomorrow, which Colin mentioned previously.
Great. And lastly, in case it's causing confusion, David and Shilpi, who's appearing on the panel, they're just helping us out with the event and are not panelists, so to speak. And the way we're going to run this is the report picks up on 4 major topics, which is obviously, to everyone's chagrin, COVID-19 and the pandemic, we're going to discuss briefly. But then we're going to get into the meat of it, which is the trend of journalist repression. And all our panelists have been dealing with this in quite a big way in 2021, which is why we invited them. And we're also going to look at something that we're fascinated by, which is the migration waves that Europe and America are seeing in the world. And then we're also going to briefly talk about the US far right. And we're going to wrap up, and Tom is going to give us a few of the key events or stories that journalists might need to be aware of from a safety perspective in 2022. So without further ado, I'm going to get stuck into COVID-19, which is everyone's favorite subject still. And I want to talk to the frontline reporters on our panel, Marty and Nima, because everyone's so used to COVID now. We all know what to do about washing hands and wearing masks. But you guys have been to some really dodgy places, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen. What's it like? How do you manage that from a COVID perspective? Everyone else is locked away at home. What are you guys doing out in the field? Nima, if you want to start.
Well, I somehow, touch wood, managed not to get it, even though at one point we'd been on the road for about 3 months nonstop. And I think so. One of the real complications that COVID created was when we were having to navigate a variety of different quarantine situations, and also the ways in which those quarantine situations, as you were going via countries that are not necessarily very comfortable with the press, even if that's not your end point. How do you make sure that all of your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed, to make sure that you're not giving an excuse for a government that wants to obstruct your onward journey? Like, that was one of the biggest parts of our thinking, is how do we make sure that we do not discredit our work or provide opportunities to bad actors by making sure that we knew every single aspect and minutiae of the different countries' quarantine requirements, and also a lot of the time making sure that we had representation that we could kind of tap in country. So we spent a lot of time in Kenya when we were reporting out of the Horn of Africa, because at one point Kenya was the easiest place to base ourselves, but we basically had to move wholesale from the UK. But that also meant that because we were going to be going to several stops on that trip, you're now having to think not just about the core team. And on one level, I think it's been quite great, because it's reinforced this idea of a core team that works together and is a bubble together. And we were talking about this yesterday, Colin, that you're not kind of just seen as kind of cabs on the taxi rank, that like, okay, you go with them, you go with them. We've come back again to this idea of, I'm trusting these people with my life, not just at the front lines, but I'm trusting their kind of COVID restrictions and the fact that they have behaved responsibly. But also, how do we safeguard the local producers and the local partners that we work with? So our kit got massive, huger than even it normally is, because not only are you thinking in the conventional way about protective equipment and protective gear for local producers, drivers, the people that you're picking up along the way, but you're also thinking about, well, they're now in our bubble, so we have to make sure that we provide them with the PPE, and especially somewhere like Yemen, where there was such a shortage of PPE, even in the hospitals, even for the doctors themselves. We ended up leaving quite a lot of our stuff behind, because it was such a tragedy in the hospitals. So it was a real balance between not allowing yourself to become that bubble of the foreign team that aren't engaging effectively with local support and local journalists and our producers in country, and kind of thinking differently, so that you're expanding the bubble and you're throwing your protection and your support out to everyone else.
But I mean, aren't you always worried, you're in Yemen, what happens if you catch COVID? It's a very good question.
Well, we brought along our own medical supplies, and everyone on the team, I need to re-up mine, but everybody else on the team had been up to date with our kind of COVID era medical training. But beyond that, I think you find yourself, mentally it is a shift, but you find yourself having to make the same decisions as you make when you go to a conflict, a particularly ugly conflict, or a conflict in that particularly ugly first phases. You kind of had to think about COVID in the same way as you did. I can plan everything, but the reality is, when I go to that front line, there are some things that I have to take, unfortunately, as a risk. The problem became, of course, that the whole world essentially became a front line for us. So we were having to think about these things when we were filming here. Like, instead of filming in the bureau at one point when people were on work from home, is it more responsible to rent out an apartment and a space so that there are no more people within this space than are allowed, but we're also allowed to keep our distance? But I think fundamentally, I mean, I remember covering Ebola in West Africa, and there were only 3 teams at CNN who were willing to do that. And part of that was that we had to go up and say to our managers, I'm comfortable. I know that there's a risk. I know that there's a risk past which you can't really plan for, but I want to go. And it felt like at the beginning we were handling COVID in the same way, that people had to put their hands up and say, actually, I am comfortable and I want to travel.
Okay, interesting. And Marty, obviously you appear on PBS Frontline, but you work for Rain Media, a small plucky production house. All of these measures that Nema's describing sound really expensive. How did you find dealing with it from a Rain Media perspective, traipsing out to Syria to meet terrorists and Afghanistan to hang out with the Taliban?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to echo what Nima says, is that you have to go into these situations assuming risk just like you always do when you go into a sketchy, dodgy place or into a war zone. So that just is part and parcel of the job that we do. So you accept that. I was in Iraq, on the streets of Iraq, covering demonstrations in March of 2020 when COVID hit. And I was immediately pulled back into the US, told that I should not be staying there. Frontline was nervous about our exposure there. So we came back to the US, and it took some time. And of course, once there were vaccines, we felt we were comfortable. And I was able to get one shot before taking off for Idlib. My cameraman and myself, we were a small team, went into Idlib province, the last remaining opposition stronghold to Assad in northwest Syria. And, we both had one shot. We felt that we were taking some risk. We arrived there, and not only do people not wear masks, many people didn't own a mask. We were in refugee camps, large refugee camps, where it was just not something that people did. And only among some of the leadership of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that runs Idlib, were there some officials wearing masks. By and large, nobody was wearing a mask. And we were able to go, and we worried about whether or not we might be exposed. There was a certain amount of denial going on at the time. I talked to doctors in the hospital, and they said, oh, no, we just don't have it. Of course, they didn't test much for it either. So who knew what was in the air? Two other members of the team that I was there with went in subsequently to northern Syria and contracted COVID. So the risk was certainly there. Then in Afghanistan, more recently, again, many people are just not wearing masks. There's not a lot of testing. You just cross your fingers and you go through that situation, and you cover it like you cover any other high-risk situation. Ironically, I did contract COVID, but not until I was back here attending a Christmas party did I come up with COVID. My wife and I tested positive a couple of days after that. She got very sick. I did not. I was asymptomatic, but that's the irony, being in Iraq, being in northern Syria, being in Afghanistan, not just in Kabul, but in the provinces. I did not contract it. So, we're a small team. We can't put together the whole packages that Nima describes. We simply, we were, by the time I was in Afghanistan, I was triple vaxxed, two shots of Moderna and then a booster. So I felt that the risk was small. On the other hand, my wife, who was triple vaxxed, got quite sick, and it took about 10 or 12 days out of her life. So.
Well, anyone who knows Marcella, Marty's wife, who's his better half, we wish her to get better much quickly. I think we're all pretty accustomed to COVID these days, and it's still causing us grief. And we are beginning to see, hopefully, the end of it. But there is a sting in the tail, I'm feeling, in the sense that the economic impact is beginning to be felt. We're seeing protests around the world. Kazakhstan took many of us by surprise. Clionadh, Ian, you guys are running big operations. You're responsible for the people like Nima and Marty. How are you adapting in 2022 to this? Are you closing up shop, or just saying, we've just got to grin and bear it and get through it now? Clionadh, you want to go?
I'm happy to if Ian would prefer to go first. But okay, great. So ACLED has always been a remote workforce because all of our researchers are in every corner of the world. So we continued as normal. And in fact, just today we released all of the data for 2021, and it's over 250,000 events. So that has continued apace from the last, we've been covering violence across the world for, in Africa's case, over 2 decades, but everywhere else for a shorter period of time. And what we've seen is that violence has certainly increased, as has demonstrations and riots, for example. But early in COVID, it is actually really hard to remember before it. But early in 2020, we released a report about the first phase, if you will. So it was kind of after the first lockdown, before the second lockdown. And we found that, of course, there had been no change in armed conflict, no change in political violence itself in terms of events or even where they were occurring. Where there had been a significant change was a drop in protests, which we all know would have been expected by often government mandates. But those quickly bounced back. And in fact, very few protest movements observed the second lockdown and subsequent lockdowns if they occurred. And of course, we saw, as Colin, you and I discussed before, this is really rife in a place like the US, for example, where, you know, COVID also hit with a populist surge, and that populist surge was happening on both sides of a partisan spectrum. And what we saw is that, whereas on the left, the social justice protests, of course, were very, very high throughout 2020. And they have died down. On the right, or those affiliated with right-aligned causes, they keep on effectively, like the Venn diagram of what they protest about really merges into each other constantly. So you might have gotten, you know, election protests, let's just say pro-Trump protests, they became anti-lockdown protests, which became anti-vaccine protests, which became Stop the Steal protests. And it was very similar people in very similar places responding to this pandemic in a highly localized way, but in a very consistent way. So we actually have not seen a change in the violence dynamics in terms of intensity or frequency.
Okay. And Ian, so protests merging, you know, what we're seeing in the UK is anti-vaxxers are really targeting the media. We've had a lot of invasions of buildings. Journalists have been abused at protests. What's it like for you? What are you telling your workforce at the moment about this?
We've got this far and let's continue. You know, I honestly think that as awful as the pandemic has been, and it truly has been awful, it's been a good moment for journalism to show how important the profession is. And so there's absolutely no let up on that front. I mean, our breakthrough came in Southern Europe, and you know, we were able to get into ERs, and you know, the guys were going in full hazmat suits. I mean, it was unbelievable what we were supplying people with, but the images we got in particular were just incredible. And I think that it showed the importance of journalism to the entire world, because this story affected literally everybody on earth. And I can't think of another one that has risen to that level. So we're still in it. And we sometimes have to remind ourselves we're still in it. I think human nature says, oh, we're almost on the way out. You know, we've got the vaccinations, it's going to be okay. But we plan to go into very difficult countries, hotspots, and sometimes have to remind ourselves we're in the middle of a pandemic. So, you know, there are threats literally from everywhere. Absolutely no let up, but we do obviously take precautions like everybody does. Just like frontline workers, you know, journalists are frontline first responders in many ways. So we do urge people to keep a safe distance where possible, you know, not necessarily run with the crowd as we might have done some years back. Look for that balcony view, maybe. Just always have that situational awareness and go in small groups if we can, and always put your safety first. You know, we have had people arrested in places like Myanmar when they were keeping their distance. We've had people fall sick when keeping their distance. There's no magic bullet here, but there are ways to mitigate, and we always try and remind ourselves of that. And you know, what I find so wonderful is the collaboration among news organizations in this space. I mean, the amount of knowledge that's shared is amazing. And you know, we compete on so many levels, but on stuff like this, we've all got each other's back. We're looking out for each other. We have someone attacked in an anti-COVID march. One of our competitors takes a picture and publishes it to sort of, you know, expose what happened. We're all in this together. And, you know, that's another positive of this.
Okay, there's some questions coming in, which I will get to. So rest assured, attendees, I will ask those questions. But I want to just move on a little bit. You said you had people arrested in Myanmar, Ian. Nima, you alluded to the fact that governments are using the pandemic as a way of shutting you down when you're traveling. And this comes back to what we've seen, and what's heavily featured in the Outlook report is that governments are using the pandemic to increase repression on freedom of speech. It's a trend that's been going on for some years now across the globe, but it seems to have accelerated. And what we are seeing as we advise journalists every day is that the same tactics seem to be replicated in different countries far afield. And it seems like there's almost this toolbox of repression that leaders and non-government entities are reaching into, grabbing different tactics and bludgeoning journalists with. Clionadh, you analyze the data. You've got a bird's eye view of what's happening.
I do indeed. I'm happy to share my screen if you would like to see some very brief visuals I put together.
Great.
So let me try to do so. When it's allowed, I think the host has to, so
Okay.
that will come in a second. So I will say that you're right. There has been a, I would say especially since I think 2019, there has been a pretty significant targeting of journalists. Of course, as you know, we started to tag journalists being attacked in any one of the events that we've covered. And in 2019, there were about 900 such events, and they weren't necessarily directed solely towards journalists, but where journalists were engaged with, let's say, a civilian population, and in some cases they were abducted, in some cases they were attacked along with the other civilians in that region. And of course, there's excessive force against protesters, which happened very often. And so the totals for 2019 and 2020 were almost identical, as were the relative rates of how they were attacked. We'll say that mob violence is something that in general is not a particularly enormous part of the spectrum of the data, but it is and does make up a very significant chunk of the modality of attacks towards journalists. Thanks very much for that. And so I will show that, this one I was trying to, you can see here, my very, very, very messy, see, it's not allowing me to bring this over. 1 second, here we go. Here we go. So here we have the regional variation, which I do think is very important to point out. This is a relatively ranked regional variation. And you can see that the modalities I have simplified towards abduction, attacks, mob violence, and sexual violence, which is actually something that is thankfully relatively rare, but did occur in some regions more so than others. And albeit a very small percentage, it's still, of course, it's a massive issue for those who may be a target of it. And what you can see here is, again, the numbers across the regions are different, and I'll show you those in a second. But the modality of those attacks across regions can be quite different. So in the US, for example, you have a very high degree of what would be considered mob violence, or in and during a riot, a journalist is targeted. And then the other, which are attacks, are where it's much more about that journalist being inside a group of civilians or a group of, let's say, what would be considered opposition, and attacked in that way. It's very similar to the South Asian experience, but in the African and Caribbean, Caucasus and Central Asia, and East Asia, Middle East, you have far more abductions and forced disappearances. And in some ways, you can see here that different governments and their institutional, let's say, characteristics have, as you mentioned, Colin, a toolbox. And within that toolbox, there are slightly more acceptable and less acceptable ways of doing things. I hope you can see that, because it's saying it's paused. So here is the relative rate. 1 second here. Here's the relative rate, which will tell you exactly over these last years where we're seeing those same types of instances, but how they vary. So again, within African states, it peaked in 2020, but it has gone down to a 2019 rate, which is still one of the highest. Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. South Asia has a real issue at the moment with mob violence, hate speech, misinformation, and targeting. And of course, journalists are bearing the brunt of that. I think they're often engaged with, or rather engaged in the targeting, especially of hate speech. But the other areas are relatively low if experiencing, like I said, variation before. Some of these variations are accountable for the fact that there were protest movements in these regions, and journalists, of course, covering those would have also been the targets within those. So there has been, I mean, it's cold comfort, but there has been a small reduction in the direct violence or violence in which journalists are mentioned as one of the victims, if not the primary victim, in 2021, pardon me. And of course, we have the first few weeks of 2022. There's been no significant change in that. But again, it indicates here, of course, that during violent demonstrations, mob violence, etc., you're seeing the biggest impact on journalists. And what this says to me is that rather than being something that governments themselves are targeting journalists with, so direct violence on journalists, they're allowing this population that has been fed often misinformation or disinformation to conduct their own mob justice upon people that they believe are spreading a message that they don't like. It's a very, very dangerous situation.
And Nima, you've been reporting on Ethiopia, Yemen. You can speak directly to what Clionadh is saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, I just really have to thank Ian, because we have been dealing with cyber harassment and have, you know, as Ian pointed out, we've all really had to lean on each other to help fill those gaps in the knowledge. So the AP, who have really been leaders in terms of recognizing and helping their people through the cyber harassment, have been helping us, and we've been reaching out to them. And that has been really heartening and so useful, because as I was listening to Clionadh, I was seeing the parallel between what we used to see, which is where you would be in a context, you would be at a demonstration at the, like, so for example, in Sudan, at the back would be the snipers and the government actors, but would also be the government supporters that had been bussed in. And you always kind of knew that you needed to navigate that bit safely. And once you were kind of in the heart of the demonstration. So it was the kind of the entering and the exiting of the demonstration, where these mobs that the government could claim were not affiliated with them, but of course were present. But I think almost more dangerously, you also have the targets of the disinformation. So it's kind of metastasizing beyond just those who are government actors or government aligned actors, to be people who genuinely believe, whether in the far right context in the US, or what we've seen with hyper-partisanship and hyper-nationalism in Ethiopia. We have had several incidents where online rhetoric, and it's so interestingly well targeted. It is always, strangely, the cyber harassment starts when we have sent the right to reply to the Ethiopian government. I mean, you could almost set your clock by it. Then, so the harassment kind of starts, and it's been really interesting to see the usual bad actors that we've seen engage on Syria, the kind of, you know, the Kremlin-backed journalists, or the alternative influencers that have been moving around the context of Breitbart and MAGA, and almost seem to be influencers for hire now. You kind of see their names popping up quite early on. Oh, fake news is coming. CNN is coming out with fake news. And analysts, these extraordinary analysts who've been working with us, had a look at it, and they managed to see that every time we have an investigation, there is a bracket of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands at certain points, of harassing emails that are either, tweets that are either copy pasted. So clearly there is a level of coordination there, or are all sent out with a very similar narrative and a very similar message. And it's very easy to say that, okay, we see when, you know, the racism happened, the racist incidents around the British footballers happened. You see it with MAGA, you see it in Myanmar, you see it when the Chinese or the Russian governments have specific messages. But more dangerously, are the people who are absorbing the disinformation. Those are the actors that are, you can't predict how they will act. So the number of times within that specific period of bracketing, we've begun to see a pattern where the bracketing happens, the cyber harassment, the discrediting, very specific to the team that they know is bylined on this reporting. And then within that same time period, people start coming up to me on the street. So and most of these people, I think I would feel comfortable if I was able to say that these are government actors. I don't think they are. I think they are, sadly, people who have absorbed an awful lot of misinformation and are the targets of the misinformation in as much as we ourselves are, right? Because they want to make this really not worth the while of an institution. I think now part of an institution or an organization's duty of care to its journalists is to be prepared to back them reputationally and from the perspective of credibility. And we spoke about this, Colin. I worry about it enormously when I look, especially at the younger women coming up, that if I was 23 or 24 and didn't have the back catalogue of journalism that I have, would my manager, and I'm very lucky and I'm very well supported by my boss, Deb Rayner, who's amazing, would my managers have been as comfortable throwing that reputational shield of CNN stands behind your reporting? I think it's really worrying, and I really worry about the pipeline and the impact it will have on the younger journalists coming up.
Now, I think you get attacked online every 20 minutes, you were saying. There's an attack coming through every 20 minutes.
So I noticed it because I'm really bad on social media, luckily for me. I'm absolutely technophobic and pointless, but so therefore it's what it has done is it's created this really clear pattern of how the harassment manifests, because I'm not really out there engaging with many people. My notifications are not kind of full. So it was every 20 hours, it was clear that there was some kind of alarm that was going off somewhere to remind them to at me, or I think it's called dogpiling, where you coordinate a specific attacker, not only to make my presence online uncomfortable. And again, when you think about younger journalists coming up the pipeline, their presence online is part of their brand and it's part of their reputation, and it's something that they cannot do without. But to make uncomfortable the lives of anybody who is verified or reputationally can confer credibility upon our work. Anytime somebody makes the mistake of saying something nice about our journalism. But I think what has been, again, to echo Ian, what has been really heartening is to see how many of our colleagues and friends have continued to retweet. I always have to kind of send apologetic WhatsApps. Hi, sorry, it's my fault. But I think there is an awareness that if we don't kind of amplify each other's work and keep it where it belongs, then that just under the sheer numbers of the way that state actors have been able to organize, that a lot of the journalism is going to start being smothered.
Now, there's a question from Hannah Storm from the audience, which asks about burnout to do with the pandemic. But listening to you, you're dealing with the pandemic, you're being abused online, people are coming up to you in the street. Are you and your CNN colleagues and the newsrooms, are they exhausted? Is there burnout?
Yeah, well, yes. And I think we have really, as a smaller team, but also in the conversations we're having with our managers, have had to really kind of soul search about, there is no, if home is no longer a safe place, if you are bringing the work into your home because you're working from home, we have to have a realization of the mental health impacts of that. Because whereas before, Marty and I would get on a plane and your head was in it. I'm getting on a plane, I'm going somewhere awful. I know that, this is not going to be great, but I trust the people around me and I think it's worth it. Now I think we have to deal with trying to explain to people, it's not just the fact that we're dealing with horrible footage. It's not just the fact that we're dealing with this outpouring of people desperate for their stories to be told, which is a privilege, but also kind of feeds into that burnout. And then in addition to that, you're in really uncharted territory. And again, I have to stress, I am 43 years old. I have a 20-odd year career. I am buttressed in ways that a lot of these people are not. And I'm supported in ways that a lot of these people are not. And so we've really had to be very conscious about the younger members of the team, just checking in on each other and falling back on that, you know, the best part of the job, right? That sense of brotherhood and just making the same things that we used to do when you were somewhere horrible, where you would come back and tell the newsroom supervisor for somebody, for a supposed competitor, as Ian says, and say, I don't think your person's okay. I don't think your team's okay. I think we've had to really lean into reminding ourselves that that is kind of part and parcel of both the privilege, but also the stress that comes with getting to do what we do.
Right. Now, Marty, you've been embedded with HTS in Syria. And I stress to anyone who hasn't seen Marty's documentary, he embedded with the head of HTS, who's one of the most wanted men in the world. And he's also been working in Afghanistan with the Taliban. These are entities that have massive apparatus of repression of journalists. But you've gone in and you've been working side by side with them. What was that like? What was the access like?
Well, let me address something else that came up first. And there's a big difference in the way that Nima works and I work, in that she has a very high profile on the ground, and she's publishing. Many of those reports are published while she's still in and around a place, or at least many CNN and other outlets are doing such. We take long lead times, produce hour-long or 2-hour-long documentaries. So we go into these countries. We don't have a high profile. We specialize in staying under the radar. People don't know what PBS is. In Arabic, there's not even a letter P, and so we can't even explain who we are. We don't have. So
you just cable. BS basically.
Yeah, we're BS. They want to say BBS, BBC, or CBS. But they're confused as to who we are and what we are, because we don't have a cable presence around the world. And when we publish, we're outside of the country, long gone. We've been in an edit room for many months. So it's a very different sort of a working protocol. I feel comfortable going into places where the so-called bad actors are allowing me access, because that means the guys with the most guns are around me. Now, in Syria, of course, HTS does not have a firm hold on power. They're facing the Russians, the Iranians, the Assad regime, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda cells that still exist. And so there was a lot of nervousness on the part of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the head of HTS, in taking us around. But he was on some kind of a charm offensive, and still is, in trying to persuade outsiders that he is not the same guy that took tens of thousands of dollars from Baghdadi to set up an Al-Qaeda cell in northern Syria, the Nusra Front. So, he took us out on the streets, and he was very nervous, and his guards were advising him. We heard through our translators that the guards had advised him not to make these forays into the marketplace. So things were naturally pretty brief. But we don't get into situations where people recognize us as CNN or ABC, NBC, CBS, BBC, and then have a particular animus, to prosecute against us. They don't quite know who we are. In the Taliban, the situation, and I'm going back in a few months, and I expect things will be much dicier, because when I was there in, November, there was a kind of feeling of great victory. Everybody was very high on what they had achieved in getting the Americans, after 20 years, to exit the country. It felt very safe in that there was not a war going on. The fact that policemen and the guards were not getting pay hadn't really stung yet. I think going forward, it's going to get a lot more difficult to hold things together for the Taliban, and I'm a little bit more concerned about what the situation will be like when I go back in the spring.
Right. Now we have a question from a Middle Eastern journalist, and given that you were working alongside one of the men who set up one of the most repressive apparatus of journalists in recent memory in Syria, this journalist is asking, in countries like Iran and Turkey and Syria, we know so many Kurdish journalists are arrested, imprisoned. What can we do as a fraternity to support them? Marty, I don't know if this is the best, if you want to answer this, but
Well, I'll give you a quick answer. I mean, I think, first of all, it has to be recognized, it has been quite said that as foreign journalists going into these places, we're far more protected than the local journalists, of course, and everybody knows this, that it's the local journalists that bear the weight of of violence against them in these countries. And what we can do is be aware of that, be supportive of the people, the local producers that we rely on. We're only as good as our local teams, our drivers, our local producers, aka fixers, and recognize that while something might not be a risk for you, because you have a high profile and you're connected to the leader, you have contacts within the leadership of the Taliban or the leadership of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the local journalists don't have those protections. So you have to listen to them as to what is safe and what's not safe. There's a number, and somebody else can speak to this, a number of organizations that specialize in defending and protecting local journalists. And we have to do all we can to recognize the risks that they're taking and to support those organizations and those people.
Can I jump in? Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in quickly and say one of the benefits of working, which Marty, of course, I totally acknowledge my privilege. One of the benefits of working for CNN is, as such a large organization, and therefore our spend is probably a little bit different than PBS's. We're kind of putting that money to good use. So part of our budget has to be a plan for the journalist who works with us on the ground, because all of our pieces result in ramifications. And so making sure that either they're out of country when it releases, I think that's one that a lot of bigger news organizations need to have a better understanding of, that part of your budget, part of your security plan has to now be for what happens after you publish. And whether that's just even setting up a security call number and a check-in number, so that when that journalist, God forbid, disappears for a little while, that, and you can kind of start. Our biggest tool has always been in this situation, the fact that we can kick up a fuss, a really, really loud fuss. So I would just personally really love to hear that other international organizations are starting to think more carefully about how a duty of care plan and I have been a fixer. So I say this knowing exactly what the setup has been in many contexts. They have to have a plan, because as you said, Marty, our work is not possible without the people who have the local context and have the local know-how. And we have to respect that and give them the same kind of shield and cover that we would give our own people.
Well, we've got Ian Phillips on the panel. He's been put in charge of crisis management and safety for AP. What's your plan, Ian? How are you going to help Nima, the young fixer?
It's ongoing.
I was very young. So.
It's by no means completed. One of the things that really interests me is, and I echo absolutely what Nima and Martin were saying, is crisis preparedness. I've been in many situations, some of them awful, and in that moment you think, what do I do? Who do I call? And so one of our projects this year is to really create preparedness for those moments. Now, you can't plan for everything, obviously, but one of them is really create a database of a network of diplomats, of NGOs, of influencers that can help in emergency situations. We've had some success on that front, not always, but it's good to have those relationships in advance so you know who to call and they know who you are. And that applies, as Nima was saying, to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're the Western journalist flying in for a week. This goes down to fixers, drivers, any support people that are working for us in any situation gets the same treatment. I wish it always worked. I wish we had the silver bullet. We don't, but I'm encouraged. You know, there are a lot of people that are out there giving really good advice, good resources. And the question was about the Middle East. And I think I lost the ability to ever have a good night's sleep after working in the Middle East for 4 or 5 years. You are always worried about your people. But now I would just say it's extended to everywhere. You know, we used to pretty much focus all of our security policy on the Middle East, understandably so. But now we're rolling out PPE to, you know, across the US, across Western Europe. We're looking into, you know, mental health issues for literally everybody on the planet that's doing journalism because it is so risky. So to answer your question again, I think preparedness in as much as we can. There are some things that we probably haven't figured out yet that we should be doing, but just the ability to find the person that can influence the person who has taken action. And it's often a young police officer who's pulled you in. And once you're lost in that prison network, it's really hard to even find where you are. But there's always a way. And I don't think we should give up hope. We should work together, as we increasingly are doing, to figure it out. You know, when someone is injured or killed or arrested, the amount of support that comes in from other media organizations, and how can we help? It's not just a platitude. It really is real. And I think if we pull our brains, there are solutions.
And just to remind the audience, Ian has had to deal with multiple arrests of his people last year in Myanmar and Ethiopia, and unfortunately the destruction of his bureau in Gaza, which none of us envy as news professionals. I want to just touch quickly on something that I hadn't seen before, but it is beginning to worry me. So in India and China, we saw the streamers, Netflix, Amazon, they had a lot of commercial pressures put on them to cave to vetting and changing content that those countries might find, or communities within those countries might find offensive. And the attack was from a very commercial basis. Nima, you told me a story about Ethiopian Airlines. I'd be really curious to hear if you're happy to share it.
Yes, no, I think part of the issue that we're having, I'm a humble frontline person, so I don't have to care. But I think part of the issue that journalism organizations are having is that a lot of these countries, I mean, you have your bad actors, you have your kind of rock solid bad actors that nobody's ever going to take advertising from, and nobody's going to ever engage with reputationally. But what about these people who are in different places along that wheel of democratization? What about somewhere like Ethiopia, which 4 or 5 years ago still repressions to freedom of speech and human rights, but effectively had been taken by most of the business community as fine, it's a going concern, you can engage with them. So we had Ethiopian Airlines as a client, and I flew Ethiopian Airlines home all the time without being paid or sponsored in any way, because there was just this sense, I think for a lot of us from the region especially, that Ethiopian Airlines was such a point of pride. But when we did our investigation into the misuse of Ethiopian Airlines to covertly and illicitly ferry weaponry, they called because they still have those numbers, and they had very good relationships. So we got a call, and I am happy to say that there was never any sense of pressure or any sense that we had done something we shouldn't do, or even nobody from the commercial side would ever be allowed to reach out to me. But it registered that now, it's not just within the kind of the global marketplace of ideas, this idea of CNN is imperialist and so-and-so is imperialist, often said by people backed by Russia. But you've it's not just within the context of them being able to argue whether you have the right to be the person who is judge and jury. It is also now within the context of, well, we also know that we have relationships that we can fall back on. and companies and countries that are willing to be involved with them. In Myanmar, you have Ari Ben Minash, who's also now working with the Sudanese generals. That is someone who has a registered ability to operate in North America. That we have former Obama alums heading Mercury PLC, which is the PR agency for the Ethiopians. So it is increasingly difficult to keep looking for where those pressure points are going to hit you. And also what it means when you have someone who is fluent in the language of how to speak to you, someone who is based in DC or London or Paris and is not calling in the way that you expect bad actors to call and say, I have your people, you have 24 hours to rescind your story. This is someone who's very smoothly calling and saying, we had a relationship, we may have a relationship in the future. Is this how you want to conduct yourselves? I mean, luckily for us in this instance, and hopefully in every instance, the answer is yes. But it did kind of trigger a little alarm about how clever and how sophisticated these pressure points are becoming.
Okay, well, I'm just conscious of time and we've still got two big topics to get through. And I want to move on to migration. So something that really surprised me is that while we've been in lockdown and whinging about how, there's not enough on Netflix to watch, the largest migration of people in the history of mankind has been going on. And the UN reports that 84 million people have been on the move, crossing borders illegally and trying to find a better life. And we saw very disturbingly, I think, the weaponization of the refugee by Belarus and Lukashenko last year, which caused all kinds of ructions for the media in terms of coverage. But Marty, when you were with HTS, you've already experienced that weaponization of the refugee.
Yeah, I did directly. I mean, you get there and there are tents set up everywhere in Idlib province. There are massive communities, millions of refugees that have fled from the south and come up to Idlib, and they are not far from the Turkish border. And the HTS uses the threat of these people coming across into Turkey as leverage, and says to Erdogan, look, if you don't support us against the Russians and the Iranians and Assad, we can let these people come up across the border into Turkey and then into Europe. And even European and American officials, diplomats, are very aware of this potential threat. So it puts people in a very difficult situation, knowing that this former Al-Qaeda commander, leader, is holding these people essentially as a card that he can play. It's kind of a reverse hostage situation where he can release his hostages. That's his threat. And so we saw this. I talked to Abu Muhammad Jalani about it. I said, well, these people are kind of like, you're using these people. And he says, well, we don't like to put it that way, but yes.
And sorry, Clionadh, I see you have your hand up. I don't know how long that's been up. It's the color of my screen is hidden that hand.
Yeah, no worries. Well, if it's all right, I might actually try to tie in what's being said. So ACLED is not a frontline organization by any stretch. And so what we try to do is provide the data and then the context of those of this conflict and however it might be conducting itself and metastasizing. And one of the things I think is really important is that, I spent last year in Ethiopia. And I heard a very, very different story than what I was getting from the international media on what was happening in the state. And it was in part because we were really trying to put together how the narrative was being taken by Ethiopians and how the narrative was being fed to a Western audience, how the narrative was being fed to an international, a diplomatic audience. And they were vastly different. And it wasn't necessarily just because of frontline media reporting things that were uncomfortable for the government to hear. It was also because the way it was promoted, such as the Ethiopian Airlines story, suggested that the regime of 5 years ago is the same as the regime today, when in fact, those two things were flipped. and they would have been quite upset.
I'm
that,
sorry, I didn't understand that point.
So
Maybe it's confusing.
Sure, I'm happy to help. I'm happy to explain it.
So you said the Ethiopian Airlines story didn't reflect that the regime of 5 years ago is the regime of today.
No, that it isn't the regime of today. So when they call 5 years ago and they say, why are you insulting us now when we've had a relationship for 3, 4, 5 years? What they're saying is that you want to support the previous regime, which are the current rebels, and you don't support us. And
no,
that
understand.
narrative, that was the narrative that was being pushed constantly, and it was being reinforced by a lot of the media, which didn't bother to mention that the TPLF was the former head of the regime. So I would say that it's very important. It's not just that the government is, I think not just Ethiopians, all governments or necessarily domestic media is producing sometimes narratives that don't accord well with the international one. It's that the really fundamental facts were not always being discussed in reports about Ethiopia, which that kernel of truth then fed this No More movement really, really strongly.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump in there because I'm very conscious of the fact that we did include in every piece. And I think my concern is that, and I absolutely hear about the narrative that came back, is that is a narrative of false equivalence, because what they were saying is, why are you treating us this way when the TPLF were repressive? And because I've heard it, right? You've heard it, you lived there. That is very dangerous. And I think you don't have to go, it's not a modern phenomenon, right? Like Sarajevo, even as Sarajevo was being shelled, there were complaints about, why aren't you reflecting the fact that a city under siege is shelling us back, right? Moral equivalence is always the thing we have to be concerned about. What my concern, I think, about allowing that narrative, and it's not an attack on you personally, but just I really want to be clear because this is a public forum, is that it creates a moral equivalence. They were not killing the TPLF in Tigray. They were killing Tigrayan civilians when they were bombing.
100%. I mean, I don't think that there's any question about how the war has conducted itself. But as you will attest to, there has been a narrative war and there's been an actual war in Ethiopia, and they are not the same.
No, absolutely.
Yes. And the narrative war was being conducted by all sorts of different actors with very different agendas. But as I think everybody can attest to, the narrative about the Ethiopian war is not this, as the public in the West might understand it, is actually not what a very full picture of what happened.
Well, I mean, I think just to come in and just,
I'm not sure I 100% agree, but Colin, jump in.
I mean, the international news agenda by nature is selective, and it's not always right, I think, and there are problems with it. So, I think we have to be open to criticism. We have to be ready to amend our views if that's necessary. And I think Ian, Marty, Nima, you probably all attest to that. I think the difficulty for us at the moment is there is so much criticism masking genuine criticism.
I think that's the best way to put it, because part of the issue is, and this was part of the reason why for months we didn't speak about the cyber harassment, because I genuinely believe that the voice that social media platforms have given to people to be able to interrogate a Western media narrative, the problem becomes when like the Ethiopian No More campaign is a perfect example that is backed by an entity that has imperialist aspirations, a state actor that I think we can all agree, Russia, while taking the language. I mean, we were seeing very obviously Kremlin-backed actors on social media using the language of disenfranchisement, using the language of, these are the same media organizations that agitated for the Iraq war. These are the same media organizations that propagate and perpetuate an imperialist agenda. The problem with that is that there are truths that we need to engage with in that criticism that we cannot, when it is being stolen by bad actors. I would love to have a conversation about Western media narratives. Bloody hell, it's part of the reason I'm a journalist at CNN. because I was so exhausted by the coverage of Darfur when I was based out of there for Reuters. But I think it makes it very difficult for people like me who both are more vulnerable, because I'm from I represent a white Western media organization, but I'm seen as a local, and I am genuinely a local in a lot of these contexts. I just don't know, and there are cleverer people than me on this panel. I would love somebody to tell me how we can effectively engage with the criticism and not just be like, well, we don't care if you think this is parachute journalism, while at the same time meaningfully keeping our people safe and not constantly interrogating them and making them feel like we don't trust their journalism.
Well, I mean, I think that's a whole different panel.
Sorry,
we have room for a whole different panel on that. So I want to talk about going back to migration, and I want to talk about another very contentious story that you worked on, Nima, where you're not even allowed back into Libya these days, and you've caused lots of issues for many other journalists.
Sorry, I'm genuinely sorry, Colin.
But if you haven't seen Nema's reporting on the slave markets of Tripoli, it's really worth watching. It's award-winning journalism of the highest caliber and really set the bar on migration stories in recent years. Nema, you went into very uncomfortable circumstances where people were being bought and sold. There was great danger to yourself and your team. What's it like going into the den of a people trafficker?
Well, we had to split the team because I and my Palestinian American producer could pass for Libyan, and the rest of the team couldn't. So there was also the kind of the added aspect of the fact that the team was going to have to be bifurcated, and two of us were going to go out with our contacts. But I think it was one of those moments where I really felt like, okay, this is where journalism needs to, and we've seen that, right? With using more people who can fit into the local context. The increase in Syrian and Lebanese journalists reporting on the Syrian conflict has been really amazing, and a lot of them have made reputations off of it. And so we were very conscious of the fact that both Raja and I could disappear within that context. So how do you then set up a security situation that allows that footprint to remain small? The joy that Martin has that I generally don't when I turn up with a camera. And so we worked through local security contacts. My amazing boss, again, Debs, set up a situation where she was like, I'm gonna be really blunt with you. No one can do anything if something happens in that first instance inside that auction location. And you are going in with that knowledge, and we have that knowledge. What is the next worst thing that can happen? You can be taken hostage, you can be taken to a second location. So how do we reinforce using local contacts, that neighborhood and the area around it, to make sure that that's the one thing that does not happen? So I felt very comfortable because I understood the context. I spoke the language. Both of us felt very comfortable about the fact that we were able to disappear with our contacts. And in fact, one of our main sources, who is just so ridiculously amazing and brave, he was the one who took us to the second location with his wife and children, because he said, it's such a conservative society, you know, leveraging the patriarchy, right? Such a conservative society that the one thing, the one car they're not going to stop is the car full of women and children. But when we got there, it was with the awareness that the only thing we really, I mean, we had an alarm button, we had trackers, we had all of that, but you're still, it's just you and this other person, and you really have to trust that person. And I'm lucky, she's a wonderful journalist, but it was really difficult because in hindsight, there was all of the preparations from a security perspective. I think what I was unprepared for, and Raja perhaps was unprepared for, was that when we got there, whether we felt able to walk away without pushing perhaps further than we had thought that we would push. So there's a scene where the auction's over and we're kind of being hustled out, and I'm kind of talking from the perspective of our cover story that I was a Sudanese maid, and I'm looking for someone who's come through the migration routes, and they're hustling us out. And I just thought, I need to know and something about these people. Is there someone we can reach? Is there, and it was, in my head, I almost felt like I became two people. There was like the journalist and there was the person. And I didn't really feel like the journalist had everything they needed. I just didn't feel like the person, the human being. I felt every one of those seconds in that little back and forth that we had. And I could hear Raja behind me, who's only I'm 6'1" and she's all of 5'1". So we were a very hilarious combination, I think. But all 5'1" of her just telling our very jittery sources to shut up, and that they couldn't go anywhere and we weren't leaving till I was done. And I think about that a lot, because I do wonder sometimes whether we talk about that enough. You know, you go in there and of course you have a job to do, but how do we better prepare people for what they think that they're going to need to be able to sleep that night or the night after? Like, I knew that and I'm not particularly proud of myself, because it was a huge, huge story that I really took slightly closer to the edge than I needed to. But I really also needed to, I think, make an allowance for the fact that I don't know, I think I almost was the ghosts of Nima future, right? I just kind of thought whether, and you can tell, like, it's been 5 years, it's still something I think about a lot, like whether I should have done it, whether it was the right thing to do, because it didn't actually change anyone's life. But it was bizarrely the most difficult part of that whole experience was getting in the car and going away from where we knew these people were going to be moved to whatever their fate was.
It's a story you can, I mean, it's a very powerful story, but it's obviously a story that you can walk away from to a certain degree, which comes with lots of guilt and lots of issues. But let's talk about a story that is going to be massive in 2022, and we can't really walk away from it. I mean, I can, because I don't live in the US, but I'm seeing, you know, I go there as a tourist and I'm seeing reports about a US civil war brewing, and I just can't believe that. But Marty, you've moved from New York into the heartland of America. There's a story you can't walk away from. What's it like? I mean,
you don't have to go very.
Is this just media hype? Is this fake news?
No, it's not at all, and you don't have to go very far from New York City to find the heart of America. I'm just in the Catskill Mountains, 2.5 hours at most from New York City. Moved up here in March of 2020, COVID March, I like to call it. It's interesting because, first of all, can I just give a big shout out to Nima and the work that you did? I was blown away by the work you did down there. It's a kind of work that, as a white man,
thank you,
who stands tall, I'm 6'4", and I can't walk into these situations at all, and have to work with crews and people that can go into these situations and be somewhat camouflaged. But here, I can go to bars and to into neighborhoods of white far right supporters of J6 or whatever, and I did that. There was a story, it never got off the ground, but I was going to travel throughout the middle of the country and try to talk to people. And so I got started on that. And you don't have to go very far from my home here to be in a community of people with Trump 2024 written on their homes and the sides of their cars, and to go to bars that are adorned with all sorts of this kind of signage. I'm sorry we didn't get that story off the ground, because it was a story in which I could immerse myself into that group and listen to people. And I did a fair amount of going to various places and bars and listening to people. To answer your question, it's real. Did I feel uncomfortable? No, because I don't have to, I don't have to profess my support for their cause, but neither do I have to argue with them. I just have to ask questions and listen. And so, they don't know quite, again, who I am, except that, I'm a representative of the media. That puts me at some distance. On the other hand, there's a whole media ecosystem that exists now, and they don't know if I don't work for one of those, hate radio sites. So it's here, it's real. I worry about it. We talk about our future here, and I'm not sure just where the country is going, but it worries me tremendously. So to answer your question, Colin, yes, it's real.
And Ian, this is something that's keeping you up at night. You've got staff who are covering this story day in and day out. They have to go into the bars and talk to people who don't like them. What's going on for your staff?
Yeah, I mean, I'll mention a case we had quite recently. I won't mention names or places, but we had a young reporter who had done a fact check, and it was on a controversial topic that really can enrage many of these people we're talking about. And I will call it a media group of sorts, found where he lived, because we don't all have the best digital hygiene. It's pretty easy to find where reporters live. And they turned up at his house dressed as fake construction workers. I mean, that blew my mind. They got, foot over the threshold, lured him out, saying, we want to show you some work that's happening in the neighborhood. And then somebody ambushed him with a video camera. And that is a huge concern. I'm going to try and ambitiously and perhaps tortuously connect Ethiopia and the US here. But in our discussion about Ethiopia, I was thinking about how it's taken on an extra dimension in that authorities have singled out specific journalists, and they put their names and their faces out there and said, these are the common enemy. That is happening in the US. People are being hunted down. It's very easy on Google Earth to figure out where people live, where their kids go to school. And this is a reality we now must face. And so we're going into a lot of our stories with a lot of discussion before publication about, okay, what should we be doing here? Because this could really kick off. Sometimes it doesn't. The ones you expect it to, it doesn't. Sometimes when you think this shouldn't be too much of a problem, it becomes a really big deal. So we have to go on the assumption that stories we are writing or filming could really trigger the worst case scenarios. I would say the same to tie in the other topic of discussion, migration. I was talking yesterday to one of our migration reporters in Europe, and she said every time she posts something on stories around the Mediterranean, sometimes it's Libya, sometimes it's in Italy, it awakens the trolls in the US. She gets a lot of abuse within minutes of publishing stories that you wouldn't think were necessarily connected to the situation in the US, but there's a lot of polarization, there's a lot of anger, and journalists are unfortunately the target.
Now, I'm just conscious of time. I would love to go into this in more depth, but I've been very unfair to one of our panelists, Tom, who hasn't had a shout this entire conversation. But Tom wrote the global outlook that you're going to get after this event. And we've covered a lot of ground, but there are certain key stories coming up in 2022 that we haven't discussed yet, Tom. Do you want to just share a few insights?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Colin, and thanks to all the panelists for a really good conversation. I think, obviously, aligned to the point of the US midterms in November, I think that's an evident key area. And just before going into some of the sort of really critical topics or themes that we might see in the year ahead, just to sort of summarize, I think one thing that we should mention around all the topics that have been discussed today and the pressures that journalists, media organizations face, whether it's online and the attempt to delegitimize the media in the eyes of the consumer, whether that's around inspiring the mob violence that Clionadh, that you mentioned, the economic angle, whether that's around turning consumers against the media in terms of feeding into that as well, the intimidation, access barriers. What is the intention here is it's really about silencing, and it's about self-censorship. And I think that's really important, Nima, what you mentioned about sort of reflecting on a 20 or a 23-year-old self, is actually it's to try and deter, and it's trying to deter people to get into this market. And I think that is one of the key ambitions of whether that toolbox that we've looked at within the report and the different mechanisms is they're all interrelated. And it's really important to understand that there is a fundamental interrelationship here at play. And the way that we respond to and manage that obviously has differences, but understanding those key relationships is really important. And to tie into some of the key events we think are coming up in the year ahead. Now, if you look back at our last year's report, we didn't say anything. Well, we briefly covered Afghanistan. This year we haven't covered Kazakhstan. There are always going to be the key stories that our crystal ball does not foresee. But I think there are some, and especially on the theme of elections, that are really important here. So Brazil, I think, is going to, and when we talk about polarization, we talk about intimidation. And frankly, if we want to draw parallels to the US, is I think Brazil is a really, really good example here and really relevant to intimidation and sort of some of the threats that journalists are going to face during the campaign trail ahead of the October elections. And this isn't just about Bolsonaro being a sort of playing the Trumpian playbook of trying to delegitimize the credibility of the election itself and the ability that he has to rouse popular support. But it's also Lula da Silva on the other side. Lula is also a very contentious political figure. Yeah, the Bolsonaro vote was very much around his and the Workers' Party's unpopularity. And we're going into this election with those two as probably the most likely candidates. There may be a third candidate, which is what I think a lot of disillusioned Brazilians are looking for. There are two potential candidates being looked at. I think it's Haddad and who's the governor of Sao Paulo, Sergio Moro from the car wash sort of scandal. But I think this is going to be a very divisive election. And what we will continue to see, and I think for media organizations to prepare for, are not only the things that we're seeing around, the Clionadh mentioned, around the type of mob violence you might get at rallies, but you're going to have increasing pressures on media organizations as well. And I think that that's really a key area to watch. In a similar vein, Hungary, April elections, the first time really that Fidesz and Prime Minister Orban have faced a credible opposition, because it's a strange opposition because it's a very, very unique coalition of sort of left to right and everything in between, but they've finally come together under a single figure of Peter Marty Kay. And actually, I think the current polls are really close. And I think that they could be so close and contentious that actually it's going to be quite a difficult election to see. And why I think this is relevant from a media angle is not so much around the aspects in the build-up to vote, but is the aftermath of the vote. And what we've seen, I mean, we didn't even talk about in the toolbox how legal pressures can be used against media organizations as well. And we've seen Orban use that to great effect over 10 years as well to sort of control ownership of certain media organizations. So I think the fallout of that vote is going to be really key. There's a lot of other key elections: Kenya, France, Colombia, which would all be quite worth note and are covered in brief in the report. Another country, just to sort of wrap up really, is that I think is going to have a massive year ahead, but not because it has elections in May, but is Lebanon. And I think Lebanon has been through an exceptionally difficult 2 years. I mean, arguably the economic crisis sort of began before that, but following the Beirut blast and then COVID, the impacts have been massive in Lebanon. And I think actually we're sadly going to see a similar sort of political stagnation in the year ahead. And I don't think the elections there are going to make too much difference, because the confessionalist system that they have in place is ultimately reinforcing and a key part of the problems that Lebanon's facing. How I think it could manifest, and why I mentioned Lebanon as well, because we could see further unrest, pockets of unrest, but also because it's such a key bureau hub for a number of international media organizations. And just for those journalists that are living there, living through Lebanon, is there's a real economic difficulty going on. There's access to cash, there's shortages, there's just electricity. So that kind of operational component of being in Beirut, I think is going to be a real key area. The report covers multiple other aspects, which we'll send. I guess the last one, which is on everyone's focus now, is Ukraine. And that's more going to perhaps the older or more traditional sort of hostile environment that the journalists are facing. And I think Ukraine, And the question mark over escalation and will it escalate is a key one that all safety and media teams are looking at now and are deploying and facing. Personally, and I've got these predictions wrong many a time. I don't think we're on the basis of or on the about to witness a big interstate conflict. I think that what has happened and the sort of build up in the media we've seen has been of benefit domestically to Putin to play that nationalist card and actually to rally behind a cause. But there's a big difference between that and actually going into conflict. There's multiple other factors on a more military base about Ukraine building up its own capability, the complexities of operating in winter, and also just potentially the prospect of getting concessions out of NATO and the current talks. But what I do see happening with Ukraine, and this is a really bizarre parallel, but to draw parallel to North and South Korea, is I think we're going to see this as a cyclical issue every 6 to 12 months recur as a recurring issue, and hostilities, bilateral hostilities will escalate. There'll be considerable concern around conflict, and then there will be sort of that will sort of die down and then resurface. Like I say, I could be way off, and we could all be on the front lines next week, but hopefully that's not the case.
Okay, but to end on a big prediction, I do remember when someone once asked me what I thought about the protest happening in Tunisia back in 2010. I turned around to Lise Doucette, the world news correspondent for BBC, and I said, Tunisia is a tiny little country, it'll affect nothing. So on that note, I'm going to thank our panelists, Marty Smith from PBS, Nima Elbagir from CNN, Clionadh Raleigh from ACLED, and Ian Phillips from AP, and Tom Bacon from RiskPal. Thank you so much for attending this year. Hopefully we get some of the predictions right. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we could run a lot of panels again on the back of this. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a good 2022.
Thank you.